Everyone, good afternoon. If you could go ahead and take a seat, we'll go ahead and get started. I hope you all had a good lunch break and had a good last breakout session before the plenary that will conclude our day. I had the opportunity to go to my first breakout session today, and it was a really fascinating discussion. I have not had a chance to ask questions and get a bit more involved and engaged, but I hope I'll have the opportunity to chat with more of you and get to hear about your sessions and tell me about all the things I've missed by not being able to join more sessions this time around. I'll be very brief, and I'll introduce ACUNS President Courtney Smith, who will then introduce our session on new leadership at the United Nations and introduce our speakers for today. Over to you, Courtney.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to have a conversation this afternoon about new leadership at the United Nations. I know that's something very much of interest to all of us in this room. I will just tell you briefly how the panel is going to work. I'll give a couple introductory remarks, and I'll turn it over to them. So we have 5 excellent panelists today. They draw on a wide range of relevant but distinct perspectives, and so I've told them they can have as much latitude as they want for 5 minutes. I will give a couple framing remarks, but they have been told they are free to ignore those, focus on what they think is most critical for UN leadership, and then we'll immediately then open it up to audience questions. I will resist my urge to ask a whole bunch of questions because I've seen you at previous sessions, and I know this is a topic that a lot of you are following very closely. So 5 minutes each, and then we'll open up to questions for you all, and I will try and make sure I'm capturing both sides, even with the lights in my eyes, and if I'm not, just somehow get my attention, get Sandra's attention. She can throw something at me, and I'll call on you. What we're going to do is talk about new leadership at the UN. A lot of you will think about the Secretary General when we have this conversation, since we are selecting a new Secretary General this year. And I kind of think it's interesting how much attention we pay to Secretary General, how many candidates want to be it, when the first person to inhabit the role didn't even want that job. He wanted to be President of the General Assembly instead. And once he had the job, he called it the most impossible job in the world. And yet we spend so much time thinking about who will be in this role. And we all know that's because it's an incredibly vital and important role. I'll tell you what keeps me up at night. I'm stealing that language from Melissa Fleming, the Undersecretary General of Communications, on her podcast. But what keeps me up at night is this. We need to select this very special type of Secretary General. A lot of us in the room may have some similarities in how we view what's needed. We will probably have some differences. But we all know we need a Secretary General that can move the UN forward in a very ambitious way. Unfortunately, of my opinion, I'm not sure that's the Secretary General that the Permanent 5 have in mind. And I'm very anxious about the coming months in terms of where the overlap between what we as a global humanity need, what we as UN scholars would want, and what will actually come to pass. I don't know about you all, but the day they start the straw polls in the council, I'm going to have a reminder on my alarm, because I'm very curious to see how that'll play out, because quite frankly, it did not play out the way I thought it would 10 years ago. So that's my question is, I'm very nervous about how we get what we need through the process that person, she or he, is selected through. But I want to also invite the panelists to think about UN leadership more broadly. The Secretary General is obviously a very key person, but it's not the only way that leadership is provided at the UN. You have opportunities for member states, even key individuals, to play a dynamic, innovative role to move an issue forward at the right moment. And right now, the major member state is not playing that role. We have a major financial contributor who is at best ambivalent toward the UN, on certain issues outright hostile. That is a problem in and of itself, but it also creates an opportunity for other member states to step forward. The question is, do they have an incentive to do so? If so, what is that incentive, and what are these countries likely to be? So with that introduction, our framing, I'd like to introduce the members of our panel, and we're going to go in the order as we go across, just because that's the order there in the program. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Michal Plinar. He is the former UN permanent representative from Slovakia to the United Nations. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Maria João Rodrigues, who's from Reaffirming Europa. In the middle is Peter Middlebrook, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Geopoliticity. Next is Ms. Dawiya Shalali, who is with the United Nations Center for Policy Research. And at the end, we'll hear from Professor Ian Johnstone, who's at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Mr. Moderator, and great topic indeed to discuss the future of the United Nations, because as we know, the current selection process is already ongoing, and as we discussed a bit earlier today in a smaller format, we have concluded that we have managed to do a lot of progress on the procedural side in terms of having a public hearing and the vision of candidates, and a lot on transparency and openness. But what remains probably the same as it was in 2016, in 2006, and even before, is the power culture. Where, of course, it still lies very much with the Security Council and in particular with the P5. But this is not what I wanted to primarily talk about. I fully agree with your assessment that it goes beyond the Secretary General, and not only because, as we all know, it is the organization belongs to the member states, and the decisions are made by the member states, but also because no Secretary General, even if we manage to elect somebody most brilliant and most capable, can do it alone. And I hope we will have a Madame Secretary General this time. So we will, of course, need to support her in every possible way. So the leadership question does apply to the member states, and it does apply in particular also to the President of the General Assembly. I had the opportunity of being there as a diplomat during Kofi Annan's term, then when we were on the Security Council when we elected Ban Ki-moon, and then I was there from the first year of Guterres 2017. So different leadership styles and of course different eras, but what I believe is crucial this time is that the SG will inherit a system under not only geopolitical challenges, but also multidimensional strain, both internally and externally. In the external context, we witness on a daily basis rivalry, veto politics, conflict, climate, death, tech disruption, just to mention a few pieces. But what I think will matter a lot in the selection process, but even more so after we have the next Secretary General elected, will be trust or confidence, if you will, and that trust and confidence will have a lot to do with the relevance of the next Secretary General. And of course, it often is about the political, the diplomatic, the managerial. It all has to be somehow coming together. But you know, if I was asked to come to meet with the next Secretary General and tell her what to avoid and what to start with, I would probably say, Madame, please avoid over-compromising, because this is something that then shakes the system and creates some disharmonies or some disbalances that are often difficult to mend, to repair. And of course, I'm not talking about political context. I'm more talking about the managerial style. We have seen in the current state of play, and I served for 2.5 years as Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director at UN Habitat in Nairobi, and that's precisely the one take that I have taken with me from within the system, that there are a lot of inefficiencies. There is a lot of overlap, duplicities, and if we want to do better, we need to do 3 things. Focus more on efficiency, on focus, and on coordination. Of course, as we all know, everybody agrees to coordination, but nobody wants to be coordinated. So I would try to really look for a delicate balance between the external diplomacy and what we can call the internal renewal that needs to take place in the whole UN system. And of course, I'm not only talking about these potential mergers or relatively simple things like that, but indeed about the deeper institutional culture that is prevailing. Pact of the Future, I think, also needs to be mentioned. It's an important tool that the new Secretary General will inherit, but I think it will be only useful if treated as an implementation tool, as something that she will have there to use for implementation. Then I believe things will be moving in the right direction. Leadership qualities that I believe are essential in this context: first, judgment; second, credibility; third, executive skills; very importantly, the coalition building, or if you will, trust building, which is linked to that; and resilience. Of course, there are good reasons why this is called probably the most impossible job that exists on this planet. So I believe that the question now is not necessarily about who can be elected or will be elected, but who will be able to govern the system and the organization effectively. And of course, when I mean effectively, I also mean inclusively, because it is only through being able to rally the member states and the secretariat behind you and lead by example, of course. The next SG will be asked to lead at a time when the world is less governable, expectations are rising, and trust in institutions in general is under strain. So the success of that leadership will depend not on eloquence alone, but on the ability to convert the legitimacy into action and principles from the UN Charter and others into credible institutional performance. I think that is the critical piece. And as was mentioned earlier, we have a key opportunity for us to really see some positive change that can lead the way in many ways. Of course, as I said, it will not happen alone. It will only happen when things are really put together. There is often, as was mentioned, a huge difference between the need and the expectations of the world at large versus what the decision makers, in particular the P5, are looking for, and whether we need a secretary or a general. And of course, I'm sure you are all familiar with what we often say, well, maybe the P5 prefer a secretary and we would all prefer a general. Well, I think we should look for neither of the two. We should really be able to find an equilibrium somewhere in the middle, because we know that this person can never act as a general, but has to be much more than a secretary. And let's hope that this is doable, and this is what will happen eventually. I will leave it at that. So.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Rodriguez, please.
Yeah. Well, a pleasure to join this panel, bringing a voice of the European Union. I'm mainly a European Union policymaker. I was minister, a member of the European Parliament, and then working in the European Commission, but also at the same time following all the big issues around the multilateral system. And what I will say now will not be about speculating about what will happen. I will not go in this direction, but rather what should happen and not in an ideal world, what should happen in the world as it is now. This is the approach I will take in my comments. And let me start by saying that we are in a completely different world. Even we take as a reference the moment as the Summit of the Future was able to adopt the Pact for the Future. We are now in a different world. Why? Because we still have a multilateral system which is not efficient as it is not inclusive as it should be, is unbalanced. But on the top of this, it's very clear that we have a multipolar world. We have a complex game between the so-called informal clubs, G7, G20, BRICS. And on the top of this, more recently, we have powerful actors, both political actors and private actors, who assume they can act above the law. And this is a worrying trend. So a new Secretary General should, first of all, conduce a strategic assessment of the situation as it is, and then defining a strategy to deal with this. And I believe that the first objective, a strategy, should be build up an alliance for multilateralism. I'm choosing the words because others proposed in the past an alliance among democracies. I don't think this is the way to go now. In the current situation, what we need is an alliance for multilateralism and a new multilateralism. That said, this means a lot of political work. This means that the new Secretary General needs to build up a camp of forces in this direction, an alliance for a new multilateralism. Having this in mind, the new Secretary General should build on what was achieved. And I remember many of us were in the Summit of the Future. We saw this was the last piece of global politics, but it was possible to adopt the Pact, and with a large majority backing the Pact. So this should be used to go further. But I also believe that it's very important that the new Secretary General has a clear strategic focus on objectives, concrete objectives, where it is difficult to say no. Example, fighting hunger. Example, to move forward with our SDGs agenda, but with updated approach. Example, the climate change, with a particular concern about, I believe, green industrialization, because we cannot forget that in the end, for many countries, particularly the global south, the green transition should be able to reform economies and bring about new kind of jobs for the young people who is there waiting for a real future. So we need to be very concrete. And my last example is about the digital transformation. Because let me make this clear, I don't think it's enough to say, particularly to developing countries, now you want to be part of this digital transformation, the promise of AI, well, you just need to do two things, is to increase connectivity and to improve skills. I don't think this is enough. Because if they just do this, they will be recipients, passive recipients of solutions created by the others. I do think that, yes, there is a big promise with the digital transformation, but we should create a frame to enable all countries to be creators of solutions, of digital solutions, AI solutions for health, education, cities management, energy, mobility. And we are at the crossroads to create a global governance enabling all countries really to benefit from this. So I believe these are central tasks for a new Secretary General. Last point I'd like to make is when focusing on concrete deliverables, At the same time, a Secretary General needs to have a deep sense how to reform the polity, the political system underlying the United Nations. A first point is to build up executive capacity which has the possibility to deal with security, peace concerns on one hand, but also with sustainable development at the higher level. Our system is still unbalanced from this viewpoint. Second, a very important feature is to increase accountability of the executive in face of the General Assembly, including not only the top of the executive, but the agencies. They need to be accountable in face of the General Assembly. And the last feature is about the role of civil society at large, because we need really to enlarge our concept of a global governance. This is more than the United Nations system, so we need to work with a larger approach. My last word is about, yes, we need a woman at the top of the system, not because this is a woman, but because we have women exactly with the list of important features the ambassador has referred. I very much agree with your list, and I think we have remarkable women with these features. So this time around, we need a woman. That's it.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Middlebrook, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't know. I'm probably the only private sector person here.
Yeah.
The only self-paying person who arrived, probably. I don't know. I don't have privy access to some of the levels you've been on. I'm 20 years World Bank, British government, UN. I went a different direction. My belief is that the world is changing and the UN is not changing fast enough. Mm-hmm. I don't believe it's possible for one individual in an entirely complex administration to make that much change. I think the system needs to change. And systematic change is either endogenous, because there's a growing awareness that the business case that was relevant in 1945 and 1947 or in 2015 no longer garners the interest of those who are financing it as it was. And therefore, if the business case isn't working, I mean, the UN has a funding crisis. That's a proxy indicator for the interests of those who would like to finance this institution to do something. The UN I would like to think of as a global public good. I mentioned the other day, and I think this is a critical factor, and I think we were just talking about it. We have a funding crisis. Elon Musk, not blaming Elon Musk, but made in 3 minutes when SpaceX went public, made in 3 minutes more than the entire funding fund the entire UN system in a year. One person, 3 minutes of funding of capital growth could fund the entire system. So why is it the UN faces a funding crisis? Because I know from my experience, and I realize this, British Passport Office told me last year I've been through 27 passports in my life. So I am the ultimate traveler probably in all of this. And I've seen the world from the outside looking in. And many things surprised me. I was just in Rwanda developing the new cooperation policy. And the Rwandan officials believe that the UN is the UN agencies, but actually they are the United Nations, it's the states themselves. So somehow in all of this, we have a brilliant agenda. We have agencies which we absolutely need, because the absence would create a gap, a global governance gap. And yet we can't fund it, or we find ourselves being caught and not being able to fund critical things, international law, human rights, and so forth. So we're at this tipping point. Now I ask myself, and this is probably a provocative question, but this is an open, honest question from a private sector dude. If you were to project out 50 years' time and imagine the UN was headquartered in Beijing or Abu Dhabi and funded by China, Indonesia, the BRICS, and the Gulf states, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly perhaps the evolution, because that's the demographic, economic evolution which is beginning to materialize. And I think this is where some of the cognitive dissonance lies. The US, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, and again, people are always upset when I do, is so incredibly in debt that much of the ideology which we've been sowing has been debt-based. And I have a problem with that, because eventually, and I'll give you a very simple example. So we were doing in South Sudan and Ethiopia and a bunch of other countries, we worked very heavily on Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. There is not a country in Africa that will meet their SDGs between now and 2060. So you're going to a political class of people who've just been elected and say, listen, we have an agenda that you won't meet for another quarter of a century. And we have a political class who come in, and every 4 years they turn over to a new leadership. So we have all of these complex cycles which are going on. So I don't know whether the Pact for the Future, having read it, I think it's very strident in many ways. I think it's hugely aspirational. It's hard to disagree with anything which is necessarily there. But I think fundamentally we need to rethink about the value of the United Nations as a public good and who owns it. Who owns it? It's not just necessarily the major powers of the world, because the world is changing very rapidly. And I suggest, if we project out just 10, 20, 30 years, there are different sets of anchor investors who have skin in the game. And they may change the agenda slightly. And that's a good thing. That would be some sort of adaptation. But I think it's incredibly important organization. I wish the Secretary General good luck in all of their capacities to do something. I do believe it's beyond any one individual to do that. And I hope those who are funding it see the reality of the world it is and try and invest towards that direction. And I think if that happens, there'll perhaps be less agnosticism towards this and greater support at the periphery for a slightly more progressive agenda. You may disagree, but that's my point.
Thank you very much. And our next intervention is going to be from Dr. Shalali.
Thank you. Not doctor yet.
Oh,
hopefully someday. Who knows? You've all inspired me through this journey, actually. I think there are a few points of tension, both in the campaign and also that come in here in the conversation, that I want to point out in this race to the next Secretary General. There is a first tension that I've perceived, which is on the conception of the role of the Secretary General between what is actually the prerogative of the Secretary General and the member states, and there is a tendency to push too much on the Secretary General from the member states, actually, and this was visible in the Pact for the Future and some of the annexes, and what they can actually do. And you can see it, for example, on the reform of the Security Council, and this is something we've discussed together this morning at a session on the next generation leadership. There's also a tension on what is desirable during the mandate once the Secretary General is elected, and the feasibility of these actual elements of campaign within the current geopolitical context. And here I want to quote the example of the Beyond GDP track that is actually a result of the Pact for the Future. The Secretary General was mandated to appoint a high-level expert group on Beyond GDP, which he did. The high-level expert group has come up with a report, very brilliant, with indications of how member states then can move forward and implement these new metrics that help us go beyond mere economic measuring of progress. However, the feasibility of the next Secretary General to actually facilitate what is going to be at the General Assembly as an intergovernmental process is another question. And finally, another tension that I've noticed here is the narrow overlap between what is acceptable for the P5 and what is needed for the global challenges of the next century. Between this vision of the P5 that might be more leaning towards a managerial role and carrying on the machine working through the UN80 process, which is leaning towards efficiency, and the magnitude of the global challenges that they are going to have to address. I can quote the protection of global commons, which has not come to forth enough in the Pact for the Future negotiation, the corporate capture, but also the reform of the UN system in general. So all of these tensions, I think, are surfacing both at the public debate, but also within the candidates themselves and the way that they present the role of the SG. And I think within the interstices of all of these tensions, there are seeds that have been planted within the UN Charter, which is one principle and one value that has carried on the story of the UN, which is the protection of future generations. It starts in the UN Charter, the very first phrase, preserving the future generations from the scourge of war, and it carried out and transpired until the Pact for the Future and the UN Declaration on Future Generations. And this is more than an aspirational principle, I would say. It's a transformational, value-based principle that has carried on and that has proven effective even within national member states, national governments, and national parliaments. It has proven effective in the way that it has been carried out as well within civil society organizations. And I must acknowledge that it's just something that has surfaced into policy, but that was already very deeply anchored in indigenous knowledge and traditional communities as well. And I wanted to showcase how much this narrative around the protection of future generations is transformational by saying that by the end of the century, we will have 89% of the population that will be born and will live in Africa and Asia. So this is definitely a very deep development issue. And because the large majority of these countries are facing a deep financing problem for their future, and they're unable to plan and act for a future in which they are bearing the consequences of the different problems that were not started by them and that were not started even by their generation of politicians. So it's more than a geographical problem; it's also a generational problem. And I just want to end my few remarks by saying that this idea of having a leader within the UN that would represent future generations has actually come to the front of the scene during the Pact for the Future negotiation within the Annex, the Declaration on Future Generations, through which member states acknowledged the Secretary General's willingness to appoint an envoy on future generations that would be in charge of creating this new impulse towards visioning, planning for the future, using more policy instruments such as strategic foresight, data, in order to plan better for the future. And actually, going back to what Maria was saying, providing a strong vision for what the UN should deliver and multilateralism should deliver. So maybe a challenge posed as well is how the next Secretary General will take on from this Declaration on Future Generations, this proposition for an envoy on future generations that could be part of this next generation of leaders within the UN that can actually provide elements of a response in what the UN does well, which is providing knowledge, building normative frameworks, but also building the capacity to think long-term within the member states.
Thank you. And Professor Johnstone.
Bravo. All right, thank you, Courtney, and thank you all. So I have a lot of great ideas about what the next Secretary General should do. I'm going to focus less on that and more on how the next Secretary General should go about the job. And I'm going to be drawing upon the notion of adaptive leadership, which actually comes out of the business literature. So hopefully Peter will correct me when I'm wrong about this. And also drawing a little bit on my own experience. I spent 10 years at the UN, most of the time in the office of the Secretary General. And I'll conclude by trying to provide an answer to Courtney's question that keeps him up at night, whether we're going to get the Secretary General we need or the P5 looking for something else. And my answer is probably not, but never say never. So first of all, the concept of adaptive leadership. I'll explain it in fairly simple terms and then try to illustrate how it says something important about the role of the Secretary General. It comes from Ron Heifetz and a number of people working out of Harvard Business School and the Kennedy School. And the core idea here is that they distinguish technical challenges from adaptive challenges. Technical challenges are problems with known solutions that can be addressed through existing expertise and authority. Adaptive challenges are problems that have no ready-made answers. They can't be addressed by applying established procedures. They certainly can't be addressed by leaders alone. The fixes can't be handed down from above. It requires mobilizing people. It requires orchestrating a whole bunch of different actors, okay? So anybody who knows anything about the UN will see that that resonates pretty clearly. And in fact, what's most interesting here is that not so much that the business literature tells us something about the UN, but in fact, if people observe the UN, they may learn something about how to manage businesses, precisely because the UN has been dealing with these adaptive challenges from the beginning. None of them, or virtually none of them, lend themselves to simple technical solutions. They're all adaptive challenges. Beyond that general insight, there's sort of four things in particular that come from the literature, and let me go through them one at a time very quickly. First of all, an adaptive leader must understand that the system is the way it is, not because it's broken, but because people in the system want it that way. Okay? So the idea here, applying this to the UN, it's not so much that the system is broken, but there are powerful constituencies that want it to be the way that it is. And that's why reform is so difficult, because there's always going to be some powerful actors who actually support things the way they are, or at least support one element of the system, and so it can't be changed. So what that means is that any Secretary General coming into the office may have a reform agenda, but can't simply tear the place up and start again from scratch. You've got to work with 193 states, and you've got to figure out how to build on the past, not to get rid of the past, because that's never going to work, but how to build on what exists, okay? So that's number one. Number two, adaptive leaders must protect voices of leadership from below. Okay, so the idea here is this, coming from the business literature. According to that literature, marginal or dissenting voices in a business often carry the early signals of the adaptive challenge, precisely because they don't have a stake in keeping things the way they are. Okay, so again, the idea here is that in the UN system, smaller states, civil society, affected populations, conflict victim, refugees, and whatnot, often see the adaptive challenges before others do, and see it more clearly than others do, but they don't have the formal power to do anything about it. And the implication there is that a big part of a Secretary General's role is to amplify those voices and make sure those voices are heard in the centers of power, whether in the Security Council or in the General Assembly or wherever that may be. The third element of this adaptive framework is, let me go back here. That adaptive leaders have to get on the balcony, okay, in quotation marks. And here, this is an analogy they're drawing to a dance hall, and you've got the dance floor, and then you've got the balcony above the dance floor. And the leader has to actually get off the dance floor, get up on the balcony, and see the broad patterns and the dynamics and the underlying conflicts that are at work. Again, an effective Secretary General needs to sort of step back from the day-to-day churn of events and statements and all of the complexities that get thrown his or her way in the course of a day, and try to see the broader geopolitical patterns. But I would add something to that from the point of view of the Secretary General, which is you're actually in a better position to understand those broad dynamics if you also spend a certain amount of time on the dance floor. And let me just illustrate this with an example from Kofi Annan. I've already heard twice references to Timor-Leste, and I've got one from there as well. After the referendum in Timor-Leste, there was a spasm of violence. The Secretary General, Kofi Annan, immediately got on the telephone. He spent 16 days speaking to leaders from, obviously, Indonesia, Portugal, the Timorese leadership that existed, Australia, many Southeast Asian countries, all of which sort of gave him a big picture of what the dynamics were at play, and that enabled him to be more effective in trying to help at least push Indonesia into taking measures to quell the violence, including permitting a international security presence, Interfence, to be sent there. But the idea essentially is that he was sort of on the balcony and then on the dance floor and then back on the balcony, and being in both places seemed to be helpful. And then finally, and this one will really resonate, I think, adaptive leaders have to be thinking about the medium and long term as well as the short term. Adaptive challenges, by definition, don't lend themselves to quick fixes in the short term. And here I want to say something specific about the current campaign for Secretary General. we're hearing an awful lot of talk coming out of member states and out of some of the candidates about delivery. It all comes down to delivery. You know, the UN is very good at producing these roadmaps, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Pact for the Future, but then it never delivers. Okay, and you know, there's and I suppose you could say the same thing. Under Secretary General Lacroix told us about these Christmas tree mandates. You know, they come up with these beautiful mandates for peacekeeping missions, but then can't deliver on those mandates. Okay, obviously there's something very important about delivery, but there's also something problematic about that line of thinking if it dominates, because essentially what it comes down to is that if the performance of the organization and the legitimacy of the organization is measured only in terms of things that have a short-term impact that you can quantify in some way, it's going to deprioritize anything that requires structural change, deeper normative developments and whatnot. And so, you know, the temptation will be do what we can do that we can deliver in 1 month or 1 year or 2 years and demonstrate we've done so and get the next round of money. And, you know, I think as I was saying that this produces managerial efficiency, but it does so at the expense of vision and aspiration and ambition, okay? And I think we want the Secretary General to be thinking not only about delivery, okay? Now, quickly on Courtney's question, what do the P5 think about this? It's very hard to generalize about the P5, and I'm not sure I would necessarily put the UK and France in the same category as the US, Russia, and China. But I do think they want the Secretary General to understand the system is the way it is for a reason. I think they want a clear-eyed Secretary General, in particular understanding where the power lies. I don't think they would necessarily mind a Secretary General amplifying the voices of marginalized groups. I think they would prefer the Secretary General to stay on the balcony and not to go down in the dance floor, keep out of the messy political waters. That's our business. And certainly I think that some of the P5 want the Secretary General to be thinking only about managerial efficiency and not so much about the visionary and more aspirational aspects of it. But I hope that's not true for all of the P5. So I'll stop there.
So my thanks to all of the panelists, plenty of insights and thought-provoking comments that we can wrestle with. As I promised at the beginning, I will turn it over immediately to questions. We started a few minutes late. I confirmed we can run a few minutes long. So we should be able to do several rounds of questions if they're actually short questions and we get some reflection from the panel. So I'm going to need help seeing hands because I've got lights in my eyes, but I see a hand down here in the front, and this side the light is worse over here. I'm making sure. So we'll start down here in the front row, and I'll be looking for other hands. Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. They turned down the lights a little so that.
Thank you very much for interesting discussion. My name is Hamza Ansari, and I represent Minhaj University, Lahore. On the freedom of the General Secretary, we have two pressing issues going on in the world right now. One in the Eastern Europe, and at least one in the Middle East. And there are at least two P5 members who are directly involved in these issues. And we have seen that when it comes to global peace and solving these issues, in many ways, UN are bypassed. So my question is, will these conflicts, these issues, who are a big strain on the multilateral system, at all affect the selection of the new General Secretary? And if not, what does that say about the position and the credibility and authority of this chair? Thank you.
Do I see any other hands at this moment? There's two over here. So we'll go up top first, and then down on the other side. Yeah. Oh, and there may be one more hand up above. Okay, we'll come back over.
Thank you very much for the panel. My name is Anna Litvinova. I work at HH Zurich currently. Something that I'm noticing in this panel, but also throughout the couple days that I've been here, is while there's quite a lot of agreement on certain things, such as rallying the troops, let's say here, or the importance of coordination and system building, there's also already, even between the five of you, quite a difference in perspective about what the UN means for some people, what it should mean in the future. And I'm noticing that the other themes that have been common to a lot of us in the last couple of days is this idea of communication, right? That there's something that is happening about both kind of inter and intra-state communication that is preventing coordinated and multilateral effort. But I'm wondering to what extent that's actually part of the very system in which that UN is and is trying to build, and part of this so-called new world, although I'm not sure to what extent that's new, part of that new world is that it does have different meanings for different people, and maybe the rallying perhaps is not so much around communicating or trying or selling in that sense, right? But allowing a system that has different meanings for people and different experiences of people. And when you say, we reduced X thing in X country by X%, what that means is drastically different, both for member states and for people experiencing life. So what is the role of the new leader or us or the system in building a world that, an organization or a world that actually accounts for these multiplicities? And aligning communication and collaboration to that rather than to coherence.
Is this working? Hello, Alan Ware from World Future Council and World Federalist Movement. I'm interested in asking Dawia Charlie to say a little bit more about this idea of a UN special representative for future generations. I know it was an aspiration of the current UN Secretary General, but hasn't been able to establish this yet. But I'm wondering whether it should be just looked at as a top-down level, like a UN representative for future generations. Might it not be better be looked at something that's more comprehensive, of engagement of representatives for future generations at all levels of governance, from city councils to national representatives for future generations, regional ones like in the EU, for example, working in cooperation with a UN representative. So it's seen as a global thing, not just as a UN initiative. And are there good examples of such representatives of future generations already in existence that could help give guidance to what might be a UN special envoy for future generations? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think there's a couple more hands, so I'd love to be able to do a second round. So if I'm going to give you each an opportunity to reply to whichever ones are relevant, if you could keep your response to maybe no more than 2 minutes, and I'll go in the reverse order just to give a chance for Ian to have the first word this time around, and the ambassador to close out. So Ian, if any of the three that you'd like to address.
Or maybe I'll touch a little bit quickly on each of them. First of all, on will the Ukraine and Gaza or Iran or whatever elements of the conflict, or Lebanon in the Middle East you referred to, will that affect the selection of the SG? Yeah, no question about it. I mean, the 5 permanent members and the rest of the membership will be thinking about what is the SG likely to do or not to do or say or not to say with respect to some of the central issues facing the UN and the international community. Whether that undermines the I think, the thrust of your question is, doesn't that undermine the credibility or authority? I mean, I suppose it cuts both ways. You don't want a Secretary General to be oblivious to those things or to pretend that they come into it with a completely blind, neutral perspective. But as you can see in the campaign, they're very careful because they don't want to sort of give the impression that they're going to be serving the agenda of one of the P5. But I think the bigger question here, of course, is, to what extent should the P5s have such a stranglehold on the selection of the Secretary General? And that's a different and important question, which I think has been addressed for a long time. Just maybe quickly an answer to the sort of multiplicity of perspectives, both among governments, but between governments and the peoples of the world. I think the way I look at this is the multipolarity and the pluralism in the world creates tensions, and a big part of the UN's job is to try to manage those tensions. It's not to try to make them go away. It's certainly not to try to sort of reconcile all of this pluralism, but rather to understand that there are different ways of seeing the world and different ways of seeing aspects of what the UN does. And that's why you've got an intergovernmental organization that has a functioning secretariat, which is to sort of try to figure out how to manage and not necessarily eradicate or reconcile or create some beautiful hegemonic wonderland being directed from above. I'm sure Dawa can answer more about this, but I actually did some Fletcher students did some research for the Office of the Secretary General on the Envoy for Future Generations, and they did some research on whether such a thing existed at the national level, and there was a couple, but not very many, but I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you for the very good transition, and thanks, Alan, for your question. Actually, yes, it exists at the national level, at different levels of governance, whether independent commissions for the government, for example, in Wales, sometimes at the parliament. There are other types of institutions at the national and regional level, and there has been a discussion even in the Latin American region to actually have a representative for future generations as well. And I think this conversation is also permeating in courts, which are increasingly taking this leadership role on preserving the intergenerational equity principle. But going back to your question, this idea of a UN envoy on future generations is really to combine the best competences of the UN with the convening power of an Under-Secretary General, as it was envisioned in the Pact for the Future, to have someone that could create an awareness an early warning system on global risks, and that could work hand in hand with these innovators at the national and regional level, but also build capacity of these of certain governments, but also of these innovators that are quite isolated actually within their own political context, and that are very vulnerable to political winds. So yes, for a network vision, and I think that was factored in from the very beginning. And I'm looking forward to see what the next Secretary General is going to do with this proposition that is very transformative.
Anything on the other questions, or passing it to Peter? Peter, you're...
Sure, I'm just going to speak to one. I was President Karzai's personal advisor for 10 years, and I was appointed by the World Bank as the co-lead on the conflict recovery framework for Palestine and the financing for it. The UN doesn't have independent financing. It's not an independent institution. It's an owned institution by vested powers who are significant players in world history. That's unlikely to change, I believe. So I don't know whether the powers change and the structure of all this changes. The sad thing, though, I think, with the collapse of international law and international diplomacy recently, which we've all been fighting for, is I believe many of these conflicts have been delegitimizing the UN system, which is a big negative, because if we can work through the UN somehow, we will, but if we can't, we'll just circumvent it completely. It's extremely problematic. It undermines the notion there is a united view on these kind of issues. So I don't know what the solution would be to that. All I do know is that the world can do better. I hold it at that.
Maria?
I will start my remarks by the issue of future generations, because sometimes there is a misinterpretation about this. Future generation approach is not only about involving young people in decisions to be made. Of course they should, but this is about us as societies to be able to have strong foresight on what can happen in long term to illuminate the decisions we need to take today. And this is even more important when we are dealing with the high speed of change, which is the situation now. So my argument is that if we want to imagine governance for 21st century, foresight is a key ingredient of governance capacity. Otherwise, we'll lose control of our direction. The second point, which was not referred, but I think very important feature of the governance for 20th century, is the media sphere. Our media ecosystem is being completely transformed. And if we are not paying attention to this, we'll lose the capacity to govern ourselves. There is no possible democratic governance without a new infrastructure on media. There is a serious problem there. And I believe this is also a matter for United Nations activity. Then my final remark is about peace and war. I don't have the time to elaborate on this, but I'm coming back to this tomorrow, probably in the plenary session, is that I believe that when it comes war, we have important transformations, recent ones. One is the fact that we have big players assuming they can wage war to reshape spheres of influence. And this is a powerful reality. So we need to deal with this. The second remark is the content of war is changing because of the digital dimension. See cybersecurity. See the kind of drones which are being invented for. See the way digital interference is taking place in our democratic spaces. All this is part of war. So there is a new reality of war. And the last point, which I call the paradox we have now, you can have strong nuclear powers waging war, putting pressure, but not able to win a war. This can go for years. So we need to draw implications of these also. Mm-hmm. But I come back to this tomorrow. It's just to open the appetite.
We look forward to it. Ambassador?
Thank you very much. I would start with peace. Well, the UN is a peace project, and of course, as was mentioned also by Under Secretary General Lacroix earlier today, the Charter really sees a huge role for the UN to play, particularly in the peace and security arena. So that conversation has to be happening with the candidates, and as far as I know, it is happening. Of course, maybe it is happening in a slightly different way with the different Security Council members. Not each Security Council member or not each P5 member has the same level of attention attached to this, and of course this relates also to the specific conflicts that we are talking about here, and of course the next issue, which is hugely discussed with the candidates, is the various reform streams. But I would caution against separating the reform agenda from the political and diplomatic role that the SG has to play. It would be certainly not advisable to do that. Of course, there is a huge role for every Secretary General to protect values, principles, and enshrined in our Charter. But they cannot do it independently without being proactive and without being engaged. So, of course, they have a very difficult and very thin line to walk on when they engage with the Security Council members. But to me, the silver lining is relevance. I mean, if for the SG, for the UN to remain relevant, there has to be a proper balance on both sides, meaning, of course, the reform agenda and the internal running of the organization, and then the important role that the organization plays, not only peace and security, obviously, but also human rights and development. Regarding the future generations and the special representative that was envisaged by the Secretary General in the report, our common agenda, which then led to the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future. My understanding is that the plan is still there. It has been delayed for cyclical and some more strategic reasons. I believe that the most strategic reasons for that have been that we somehow need to consolidate the various tracks that are part and parcel of the role that this future special representative would be able to play. Because, there is a lot of moving targets. When we are talking about future generations, we need to look at the threats and challenges, whether it's climate or it's digital and tech or it's, other challenging areas where we should be looking at protecting the interests of future generations. And as was mentioned, there is a distinction between the role of youth now and, of course, the responsibility that we have as international community and as the UN for future generations. So I think the idea was that things need to be better fine-tuned and structures need to be seen, because as Maria mentioned, it is also about strategic foresight. It's not just, it's easy to create a new role of the special representative, but then how exactly he or she would function within the system. We have seen the situations where new positions were created, and then somehow the person was not really considered seriously. When some of you will remember Jayatma, who was earlier the youth envoy, and I remember countless conversations with her about how difficult it was for her to actually be invited to some of the senior management meetings, to be heard, to be somehow taken as a relevant actor. So I think still a lot more needs to be done before we move into the practical implementation. And yes, I agree that it has to then be translated into different levels of governance to a great extent. But then it is up to the member states, of course, how they will take it up. And the last question was on communication and accountability. And it is a crucial topic indeed, both internally and externally, if you will. Especially for the young generation, and definitely for the future generations, we will see a complete overhaul of how information is shared and how information is processed, and we have a lot more to do in this particular context. And again, it is linked to the overall relevance of the future UN. So certainly a lot more to be done to ensure that we are doing the right thing.
Thank you. So what I would like to do is, I know there was at least one more question, maybe two, and then we'll do the last round. We'll also give everyone a chance to give a wrap-up comment as well. So I think there was there's two hands over here that I can see. Gosh, I can't see them all. So we're obviously not going to be able to, there's one down front here, I know. Oh, there we go. Oh, there's a lot of hands over here, and I don't see any over here. One over here. Okay. So very one-sentence questions, and we'll let them, in your closing remarks, you can pick and choose from among them. You will obviously not be able to do them all. So one-sentence intervention, okay? Yeah.
I'll try. Georgios Kostakos, formerly with the UN Secretariat also. My experience is that these reform exercises happen again and again. It's like having the UN as a hamster going around in this machine, producing a hot wind, but not real effectiveness. So we want an efficient UN, but we don't know really the capacities of the UN. Like for foresight, there are policy planning units in each department. When they coordinate, they can really include foresight in their work and advise the Secretary General and his office accordingly, or her office, in the future. So will we allow the new Secretary General not to be playing this hamster role, including also with the Pact for the Future, new indicators of achievements, etc., and focus on delivering effectively for the people to connect? Otherwise, it's an internal exercise often that may please the major contributors, but doesn't make the UN more relevant to the world, and also demoralizes the Secretariat. It gets a lot of capacities that are not used. Thank you.
Okay, so on this side, there's one in the front row, and then on this side, there's a couple up higher up. So if we could get the mic up higher, and then we'll go to this side just because the mic's right next to you now. And then we'll get all three of you up there that I can see. Yeah.
It's me first. Okay.
Yes.
Thank
yeah,
you.
please. Yeah.
Blanca Montejo, United Nations. I'm actually delighted to see a representative of the private sector in the panel. And I had a question for you specifically. It was interesting to hear you say that the UN is becoming a global public good, and at the same time that the UN is not changing fast enough, and at the same time suggest that one individual on the planet can finance the UN in 1 minute of his time. What does it need to happen for the private sector, as in the corporate sector, obviously, because civil society organizations are supportive of the UN every day, to support the UN financially and to become a support group within governments to make sure that the UN survives into the future? Thank you.
And then I know there's, good, already have a mic, excellent.
I'm Ian Hurd at Northwestern University. I'm struck that most of the comments from the panel and the audience so far have been cast in terms of what should happen in choosing a leader or once a new leader is installed. And I'm interested in the difference between the should and the real, since we know the decision is largely in the hands of a few leaders, and these individuals are not known for their deep thinking, forward-looking, even-handed judgment in the interests of everybody. So how would you have us think about this gap between the kind of wishful thinking version of the United Nations and the actuality?
Sounds like I'm not the only one up at night. Okay, I think there's a mic already over here. Oops, sorry.
Hi,
And
thank
then
you.
at the
Rebecca Shute, I'm the co-convener of the Impact Coalition on Strengthening International Judicial Institutions and co-convener of the Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court. And my question is about the role of civil society in the future of the UN and multilateralism. We are obviously enormously indebted to the One for 8 Billion campaign and many other partners for helping steward a thorough exploration into the background and intended platforms for the next Secretary General. But if I may, civil society engagement at the UN has been largely retrofitted through mechanisms like ECOSOC accreditation, major groups and other stakeholders. And with the Civil Society Summit in Nairobi, which was also the first in the Global South that led up to the Summit of the Future, we had the chance and we saw real attempts to reimagine our interaction. I'm speaking as the common we on behalf of a very non-monolithic civil society, but to reimagine civil society's engagement with states parties in multilateral governance. And so what recommendations would you have for the next Secretary General, understanding that this is not only her anticipated platform on day one and whether or not she's ready to take office, but how she will have to readjust over the course of her mandate? Thank you.
Okay. And then right behind you, yes.
Hello, everyone. Lena Lyon, University of New Hampshire. Just a question about the conversation. So, I always teach about secretary versus general, but in the work that I've done with many of you in this space, we also thought about UN secretaries general as also moral authorities. And when we think about, quote, the best secretary generals, the ones that we tend to think of as their strength, Dag Hammarskjöld comes to mind, and then Kofi Annan. And their strengths usually came not only in their bureaucratic management, but also their ability to nudge great powers with moral arguments, not necessarily bureaucratic ones. And so my question is that still relevant? And then I'm going to ask panelists, if anybody's willing to go on record, if they see a candidate who can thread the needle between Secretary General and moral authority that may be already on the scene. So thank you.
Okay, so those are great questions, a lot of them. I think in the interest of time, if each one of you could pick like one of them to highlight and then use that as your wrap up. And then I will invite everyone to if we don't get to all the questions, you remember who the panelists are. We've got another day of the conference. We've got coffee breaks. We've got a lunch. Continue the conversation and enjoy that. We don't have a reception today, but we will again tomorrow. So I'll go from the middle out this time. So I'm going to start with Peter, and I'll go to Maria and Dawa, and then out, just to mess it up. So Peter.
I'd start with the private sector. In the private sector, we say talk is cheap, money buys whiskey. Second place is the first loser in the marketplace. I'll just relate a very small story, and I keep it short. I led the drafting of the UNSDCF, the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework for Azerbaijan. And in the final session with the president, we had about 1,000 people there. This on the back of Addis Ababa Action Agenda, having led much of this work. And I asked 1,000 people, put your hand up if you've ever been in the private sector. There was one person. These people don't know. They're all subsidized by taxpayers. They're all public servants. There's a fundamental disconnect between all of this. We've done a lot. There's more capital in this world to solve our problems. Trillions are just sitting idly in bank accounts as well. So I think it's right. I think there needs to be another level of conversation, not just on de-risking, incentivizing, and blending. I think beyond that, to create a different set of strategic partnerships where the private sector can play a more proactive role, including in the public good space. I mean, we can't even have that discussion probably. So I don't know the answer to the question, but over double whiskey, who knows?
Yeah, that actually might be the best way to get your answer to Lena's question on to name a specific candidate. But Maria.
Well, we say there is a crisis of legitimacy of the multilateral system, but we know that we can deal with this in two ways. Either the input, legitimacy, or the output. We need to work with both, but I'd like to focus on output legitimacy. This means delivery. Mm-hmm. Let me give a very concrete example, very, very, very concrete. We are close to a possibility to enable many, many citizens, in fact, millions and millions of citizens in the world, from the north and from the south, to have much better access to the so-called key sustainable development goals in their pocket, using their smartphone. I saw this happening in India, large scale. I saw this happening somehow in China, more controversial. We are about to take the same decision in the European Union. This is technically possible. And I think the United Nations should promote a big process in this direction, because this can give us a shortcut to deliver SDGs. This is my concrete proposal.
Thank you. Dalia?
I'll go back to one of the previous questions, actually. My apologies for that, on constant narratives. And I forgot this. I think we were talking, and Maria, I think this is you that mentioned that, and a lot of you actually have been saying she for the Secretary General. And it's true that we have never been closer to have a woman as a Secretary General. But I would say that we have to be very careful about the narrative, because taking from the literature of the private sector as well, there are psychology studies that showcase that within an organization, when it's most in its peak crisis, this is where it's most likely to have a woman as leader. But then they inherit all the failures of the system, and they are never blamed they never blame the organization, but actually because of the fact that they're a woman. So I think we need to be very careful about the narrative around, oh, we need to have a woman because women intrinsically have X, Y, and Z quality that can save the system. And I think this is something, a risk in the narrative and in the communications that I've seen in some campaigners actually using this. And I would say the risk for the UN is that it's not the UN that will be blamed for the problems of the world, but women actually being blamed for the problems of the world. And I don't think this is what we need. So carefully craft this narrative around the intrinsic qualities of being a woman at a leadership position.
Thank you. Michael?
Wishful thinking versus reality. I think this is quite a typical situation for any campaigning or any people who are running for any elected or selected job. No, we see it in politics. It's often easy for politicians to make promises, and then of course when they have to deliver, it's a slightly different situation, and some succeed and others often don't, and then we see a lot of disruptions and other things happening. In this case, in the Secretary General's case, if I was able to provide to him or her additional recommendations, I would say it really matters about the teams that you will create, because of course no single person, whether it's one of the current candidates or somebody else, would be able to deliver on the daunting tasks. But crucial is really to lead by example and surround yourself with really a strong and credible team that will help you deliver on these various daunting tasks. And if there is a real relationship created, if there is a lot of listening, both within the team and of course then in the relationships with the member states and with the decision makers, the leaders, then we can expect success. And of course, when Kofi Annan was mentioned or Hammarskjöld was mentioned, yes, these are some of the good examples, I guess. But let's not forget that the geopolitics today is probably far more challenging than it was for some of the predecessors of the future Secretary General. So, the reality, of course, will provide a quick test and a quick situations that will need to be addressed. But I believe that things can be done despite the challenges if the system is built according to those expectations. If from the outset there will be a gap between those promises and the capacity for delivery, then probably we'll be in trouble.
And Ian.
I'll conclude with two comments. One is about the role of the private sector and civil society together. There are a multiplicity of views, of course, on what role civil society or the private sector, the tech sector, could be playing in the UN. So governments are divided on this. And again, part of the job of the Secretary General is to sort of manage that tension. But I do think over the years there's been a noticeable shift in the direction of more openness to both private sector and civil society, even among the most resistant authoritarian countries. So I think there's movement in that direction. On the wishful thinking versus reality, so Ian Hurd will appreciate my response, which is because he's written about this and a leading expert. But reality is constructed; it's a social construct, and so what looks like reality, of course, is a state of affairs that exists because of a certain set of circumstances and can change. And I think the Secretary General, to a limited extent, has some ability to help construct or change that sense of what's real and what's possible through the normative role, through the moral authority, exercising moral authority, through the managerial role, through the political role. So I guess the line between wishful thinking and reality is not as sharp as Ian well knows. And I guess we kind of hope there's a Secretary General who figures out how to delicately strike that right balance between living with the reality of we've got it and trying to change that reality.
Mm-hmm. So the reality of the situation is I could keep doing this forever, but I do know that some of you probably have evening plans. So I really want to please join me in thanking the panelists. Wonderful interventions. So thank you all. And thank you to all of you as well for engaging questions on the end of a second day of day 2, and I hope you carry that energy into day 3. I have some gifts for the panelists, but in the meantime, Sandra, can you give us guidance for tomorrow?
All right. Thank you, Courtney, and thank you to the panel for such a wonderful discussion. One quick note just from what we've discussed today. One thing that stands for me is the emphasis on the Declaration on Future Generations. We have some high schoolers in our midst, which is really wonderful, so I hope they get to meet you and mingle with you, and that you'll get to introduce them to your work and the research that you do. I think this is a great opportunity for us to contribute to the engagement of future generations. As we conclude, I would like to just note that tomorrow we start at 8 a.m., not at 9 a.m. So please make sure that you're here at 8 a.m. for your morning sessions. And then we have so much to look forward to as our last day is tomorrow. We have the Holmes Lecture, the Global Policy Dialogue, the simultaneous a plenary on the future of the Pact, and then the closing ceremony to close us out. So see you tomorrow and enjoy exploring the city, and we'll see you here tomorrow.